December 26 of 1991, one of the most influential nations in the world, the Soviet Union formally collapsed in on itself, ending its nearly century-long influence over the world and bringing down socialism with it. Socialism is no longer considered a viable entity, as the USSR is used as an example for socialism's political uselessness. But how true is this example? To what extent was the collapse of the USSR a result of the socialist theory behind it? The collapse of the Soviet state is multifaceted, with multiple physical causes, with the primary being economic decline, ideological disillusionment, and political factionalism. These three physical causes of the Soviet Union shall be explored and explained through the lens of socialism, to understand just how responsible socialism is behind each, and just how responsible socialism is for its own fall and the fall of the USSR. A key reason for Soviet collapse is in fact the failure to uphold and successfully execute the very thing which it was formed for, economics. Economic failure and decline had been characteristic of state socialism in Western Europe since 1975. The problem became explicit during the 80s and 90s as the USSR and its satellite states fell into economic and productive decline, yielding to Western powers, and in some instances falling behind third world countries. This persisting decline was not due to natural external reasons, as the Soviet economy was anything but natural. The Soviet economy, being for the most part centrally planned, is the reason that most turn to in explaining the economic downturn of the Soviet Union. An inflexible and undiverse economic system is detriment to any sort of economy. Not only this, but the increase in quantity and production was often supported in sacrifice of quality. The rapid growth of Soviet industry, brought around by this central planning, was rendered useless by deficiency in quality, and thus this model was economically unable to sustain itself in the long term, being only useful in the short term. It is often suggested contrarily that the benefits of a planned economy, such as being able to achieve rapid and consistent growth of national wealth, as well as providing economic security to the state, should have avoided the severe economic downturn that the Soviet Union eventually underwent. There is even historical evidence as to the speed which the Soviet achieved growth under this model in the pre-60s, showing that this model can work. The problem did not arrive then from the socialist theory itself, but rather from external pressures placed upon it. Given the superpower status of the Soviet Union, the effort and labor provided by the people of the Soviet Union was concentrated into maintaining this status through military means. The period under Brezhnev saw a peak in militant spending and diversion from other areas or aspects of Soviet life. Inevitably, after the years of sustaining unsustainable industries and unnecessary labor, the economy was crippled and the state fell into deep decline. This was due to an increasing amount of pressure placed upon the inflexible, centrally planned system. Thus, the conclusion can be made that economic failure led to the inevitable downfall of the USSR, and these economic issues were only so deadly due to an amalgamation of the limitations of the economic model of the Soviet Union and the immense pressure placed upon it by military spending, and the Union's attempt to maintain global power status. Thus, socialism is responsible only in the fact that its contribution of centrally planned economics, and ultimately limiting design, did not suit the needs of the state and could not sustain itself in more complex environments.
Is therefore of supreme worth.
Ideological failings of the Soviet Union ultimately led to public unrest, civil disobedience, and eventually the collapse of the state at the hands of its own people. The lack of confidence in the quickly deteriorating system was in fact the cause rather than the consequence. This ideological disunification from people from state, although perhaps not an instigator for the collapse of communism, certainly created predisposition towards change. Effective implementation of socialist ideology would have meant the solidarity of citizens to both state and socialism. However, in the final days of the USSR, those whom the system was said to emancipate called for the disintegration of communism itself. A manifestation of this was the organized miners' strike of early March 1991, preceding state collapse. It was particularly disruptive due to it being primarily political in nature rather than economic, with the demands of the miners consisting of the resignation of Gorbachev and the de-establishment of the Soviet and its replacement with a republic. It is safe to say that underlying these demands was a working class and citizenry disillusionment from the state and socialism. The question arises as to what could elicit such opposition from the people, and to what extent was socialism's involvement. Despite being populist, it was inherent in socialism that it could not psychologically provide for the people. This is a belief held by Ruben Silber, a socialist whom cites the example of the implementation of the socialist doctrine of from each according to their own ability to each according to their work, upon wages. What followed was a society in which little differentiation was made between the skill levels or social value of labor performed. Significant groups of people rightly felt that their rewards, both material and psychological, did not match their expenditure of commitment and loyalty. Although this is a single example, it nonetheless exemplifies the lack of psychological incentives given by socialism needed to convince the populace of the system's legitimacy and necessity, thus leading to a failing of socialist ideology as the core basis of belief within the Soviet Union among the populace. On the contrary, socialism, as the core basis of state socialism, was not always lacking in appeal to the people, but rather lost its appeal over time as it became less and less relevant to the large majority of citizens. By the 1980s, the population of Soviet Russia was not proletariat, nor worker, nor peasantry, but rather intelligista, professional middle class. Marxist-Leninist thought had emphasized the lower classes in its theory, so the Soviets' version of equality was always designed around this in mind. Ultimately, this created ideological disunification with citizen from state as time went on, as less of the populace could relate to the ideals socialism expounded. The accompanying increase in education also contributed towards inclination for change, evidenced in the years preceding the collapse of Soviet-style governance in Western Europe, in which an aroma of negative attitude towards socialist principles was present among intelligista of post-Soviet nations. Thusly, it can be concluded that socialism's lack of incentive towards anyone outside of specific classes and the waning presence of these classes within the Soviet Union, coupled together to disunify the people from their ideology, as almost all citizens found themselves forced into a system they no longer believed in. An absence of political and national unity amongst the subjects of the USSR resulted in the splintering and disintegration of the state. The USSR was heterogeneous in the greatest sense, both nationally and ethnically. For reference, 50% of the USSR comprised of non-Russian citizens. This is not to mention the various satellite states whom answered the Soviet authority, all of which further muddled the state in more political division. The hegemony of the state in terms of identity and politics was in greater years suppressed and assimilated into the communist ideology as a means of unification. However, in the final years of the Soviet Union, the outer peripheries of the state, alongside its multiple satellite states, spontaneously seceded from communism and state in rapid fashion. We know from before that socialism was no longer a unifying factor among the people of this state. What is not known is what rallied the people to this secession, or what political structures allowed for it. One of the first nations to secede was the Baltic state of Latvia. Latvia's Declaration of Independence proposes that all nations are free to manage their own natural wealth and resources in order to reach this goal, and that no nation can be denied this right to the means of existence belonging to it. Much like the rest of the document, there lie implicit Western undertones, however implicit, such as self-determination, capitalism, and nationalism. This gives implicit motivation to the secession of Latvia, and indeed to the entirety of organized dissent, which originated from this domination of Western ideas over communistic ideas. It was this bourgeoisification that disintegrated the Soviet state from within. This correlates historically, as these events occurred within Glasnost, a period of radical reform in which the USSR was actively propelled to becoming more Western and capitalist in its governance. It is now obvious that the diminishment of the USSR was a result of these reforms, as not only did they introduce en masse the free trade of concepts that would incite the replacement of socialist principles with nationalistic ones, it also allowed for political reform for this expression against the established order, such as the introduction of a multi-party system and independent news outlets, allowing for opposition groups to arise. But how is socialist theory associated with this fever of political severing? It is often thought that this political disunity initiated in the communization of these lands and these people. There was a drive to extend to the entirety of the capitalistic world implicit in all Marxist-Leninist thought. It can also be found in state socialism, which was a reason, however minor, for the physical expansion and satelliting of all Western Europe. Thus, this is responsible for the later hegemony of the state. Therefore, the political fracturing of the state was only caused by an ideological delusion for communism to conquer capitalism, which only ended in capitalism conquering communism. To conclude, the failure of the USSR and ultimately of state socialism cannot be said to be entirely at the hands of its own beliefs and trusts in socialism, as it is equally at the hands of human and historical factors. Decline was brought about by the fundamentally flawed aspects of socialism, married with political change, as in political fracturing, the implementation of that theory, as in economic decline, and the changing individual across history, as in ideologies failure. Thus, the failed experiment that was the Soviet Union leaves behind a legacy of learning for future generations.